What is up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we are coming at you each and every week with a fresh service to debrief in an effort to send biblical truth. What better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I'm Mark Francis, in one of the host seats today. I'm excited to be surrounded by, I feel like, student ministry people.
The gang.
It's the young people invading our church. They're coming for us, ready to go. So I've got Emma Kate. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Emma Kate Culler. Give us your official title here at the church once again.
Associate Director of Student Ministries.
Love it. Awesome.
Yes.
And you also are host on the Global Church podcast.
Mm-hmm.
You've been here occasionally. Excited to have you back in the hot
Thank
seat
you.
over there. Well, actually, no, the hot seat is over here to my left.
Yours truly.
That's Mr. Caleb Pearson.
How you doing, buddy? Good.
Excellent. Promoting a Sharando football sweatshirt.
Gotta rep
today.
it. You know what I mean? Class of 14. Playoffs have started.
Are they doing okay?
Oh, yeah. They're good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
So-
that's always the case.
The sweatshirt's also just super comfy.
Awesome.
So, anyway.
Yeah. Well,
But yeah.
it's a hoodie day for me. So fall is here. Christmas season is right around the corner. But before we have
Thanksgiving's
Christmas,
next
Thanksgiving
week.
is next
It's
week.
crazy,
Oh my
man.
gosh.
I'm ready for it.
Yeah.
I love it. And it's kind of like a fun season. We get a chance to reflect and have gratitude. And this, by the way, a little hint, in this upcoming worship service this week, we're going to get a chance to do that. So
Sweet.
yeah, the worship team loves to celebrate seasons like that. But let's dive in. So, Caleb, you got the pulpit this weekend. And moving past the storyline of Jesus, right, of kind of those first 7 movements, if you want to call it, of everywhere from the pre-existent Christ to what he's future doing, to now let's dive into certain texts, certain passages that can help unpack that even more for us, right?
Yeah.
Is that how you would expand kind of these next several weeks of the sermon series?
For sure. Yeah. So this was kind of the first week of a little bit of a pivot, but there are so many passages that are Christological in nature, even though they're not specifically recapping anything Jesus is going to do, but more who he is. So it was fun to
Yeah.
brainstorm that and figure out how to package it.
Yeah, I want to learn more about that, but Emma Kate, I'll come your way as well, because we love to hear just what was your experience? What was your takeaway
Yeah.
from the sermon and the worship time itself?
Yeah. I really appreciated Caleb's focus on, okay, let's talk about the greatness of God, the greatness of Christ. And I really appreciated that it wasn't anything new. Like, it wasn't things that were brand new. It's things we already know, but Caleb was saying, okay, let's take the time. Let's appreciate truly how great this is. Let's not take for granted that God is a communicator. I loved how you brought that out in your first 2 points about how he is a God who communicates, because there are a lot of religions that's not true of how they see God. And let's take a moment and appreciate the greatness, not only in that he is one, but how he communicated to us through the Bible, through the prophets of the Old Testament. And I really liked how that tied into what Tim has been teaching a couple months ago about beholding. Okay, let's sit in this idea for a little bit. Let's recognize truly how great this is.
Because we're still in the series entitled
Right.
Behold Him. And,
Right.
and throughout each of these sermons, and as we're going to go diving deeper into these scripture passages, we should still be thinking, how can we use this to behold him more? And I love just the greatest of all time concept. You came to me in Fellowship Saturday and you're like, what do you think my opening graphic is? And no, but you spoke to my generation. Michael Jordan is the greatest of all time when it comes to basketball. So you spoke to me, but it rang true. It stuck in my mind of, well, if I'm associating just a human as a great person in his craft or her craft, man, why am I not recognizing Christ for who he is? And just posing that to myself on, the last couple days, how have I seen Christ being great? And looking at that Hebrews passage of, it is very similar to that Colossians passage. He holds all things together, by the word of his power.
Yeah.
And just man, you can get lost in our own shuffle, I feel like, as humans, as people, with this upcoming holiday season. Man, we should be beholding
Yeah.
Christ for his greatness.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think outside the Bible or in the world and culture, and I use that example from the basketball world, greatness leads to passion. You how people talk about these figures, the example of the Michael Jordan, LeBron James thing. Like, what if Christians talked about Jesus like that? That's a heated conversation that can offend people, and you follow it, and when we experience greatness, that is a natural consequence of it. There's you become passionate towards that greatness.
Yeah.
And then you can rally behind it and you understand it. So as I'm studying Hebrews and as I'm going, okay, how is God specifically great? Obviously, it does detail what he's like in the passage. This was not hard to interpret or exegete. 4 verses, the 4 verses served as the 4 points of the outline. But I just kept coming back to this idea of God is actually a great communicator, always has been. And that's what the author of Hebrews is doing. God's final word was his son. But it wasn't this change in God's voice. It wasn't anything out of the plan of God, but it was fulfilling all of that. And so I pretty much just did what the author of Hebrews does, explains this is how it happened, and here is how it's happening for us, but to raise the value of Jesus and his words to us now. And so that's kind of how the packaging of the sermon came to be, to just try to, I don't know, stir the pot a little bit or get us excited about Christ. Because what we run the risk of, you study Christ weekly, you run the risk of being bored of
Getting
him.
bored, yeah.
or like, I already know all this.
Right.
But then it's like, okay, what is the depth of that knowledge? And how can we open our eyes and hearts to the, wow, this is actually worth savoring. And then I can actually hopefully speak, not just knowledgeably about God, which I think our church can probably do, but let's speak passionately about him.
Yeah.
So that was kind of how that...
I appreciate that. I mean, because if anything, our church can use some more passion, some more just that excitement to bring, yes, not just to the worship time and the experience of us together, but to bring that passion into the world around us. And I need to do a better job of that, of just being reticent to openly share. Yeah, look at what Christ has done. Look at what he's doing right here in my life and how he's working through me and other people. It's not always on the tip of my tongue, you know? So,
yeah. Well, and obviously so many of us understand and believe that Jesus is the way God saves us, but it's easy for us to forget Jesus is still the way we're going to know God. We're going to know and understand God through Jesus, his words, his actions, who he is and what he's like, not just the head knowledge of what he has done and will do. And so it's, again, just pointing people. That's the tricky part about teaching this kind of stuff. You point people to Jesus, but that's an ethereal statement. It's still vague. So it's like, okay, what about him can we appreciate? And I love the way the story unfolds of him being the great communicator. When I came across the Jeremiah stuff specifically, I was kind of like, this, I don't know if this is going to stay in there because it's not Hebrews 1. Like, what are we doing here? But what I wanted to just paint a picture of is like, look how much God has cared about how he's communicating and how other people are communicating on his behalf. So if he's willing to wipe a prophet off the face of the earth for clarity, and now he's saying his final word is in his son, he has been intentional and intimately involved in his message the whole time. He is the great communicator. I love what you brought up just now on the podcast. Other religions don't paint God as a good communicator. They actually paint him as a horrible one.
Yeah.
So then the goal of the religion is to discover him and discern what he might be saying. And that's what led me to the Scott McManigal video as well. How can we share that maybe a lot of us understand, okay, yeah, this is what God is like, but a lot of cultures don't. And I love where Scott went with that conversation, where he's seeing in the global church some things that the American church now needs to be reminded of. Stop giving credit to the hypothetical spiritual realm and what do you know about God?
Yeah.
And what is this? How, whatever is happening to you, good or bad, how can you look at it from a God-centered worldview? And so I thought that kind of helped it tie together.
And that even spoke to the passage of Hebrews, that Christ has become as much better than the angels. So he's speaking to that spirit world. So you're staying true to the passage, but then elaborating on the greatness of Christ all at the same time. I'm curious, like, how did this passage come to be as the first one in this part of the sermon series?
Yeah, so Mark, Tim, and I had conversations about which passages are going to be a part of this. And so this was part of that list. And so Mark wanted me to do Hebrews 1 this week. Now, I don't know how intentional obviously the Spirit ends up doing all this, but I like that we're a little over halfway through the Christology stuff. And so it's a good time to awaken people to the reality of what we're actually doing here. And so the timeline study, so to speak, is over, but now we get into character study. And I like the idea of passages being added to our arsenal a little bit of our Christology. Where can we go? What could we memorize or at least know? I love the reality that there's two ways to memorize Scripture, which is beautiful. One is to memorize the verses and the words. The other is just memorize the passage where it is. If you don't want to memorize Hebrews 1 through 14 to know about Jesus, just memorize this phrase, Hebrews 1. And so you can go there and you can remember, oh, okay, this is actually how Jesus fits in all this. And then you realize our advocate is the one who's above the angelic realm, above the spiritual realm. So they serve his purposes. And he's the one that we're placed in. And that just really helps. It reorients our thinking in a lot of ways.
And you began the sermon by pointing out that the writer of Hebrews begins with the word God, that he is the one initiating. He is the one that our focus should be on. He is the one that we should be giving our attention to and nothing else. And that he is the great communicator. And therefore, Jesus is kind of not the conclusion of the communication. We're still in the middle of it here, but man, Christ is the focus of everything, which is why leading up these past 7 weeks of the pre-existent Christ all the way to the future Christ is so valuable for us to have the perspective when we look and dive into a passage like this in Hebrews, because without that perspective, you might not truly see how great Christ is.
Yeah. And that makes me think of a statement you said at the very end of the sermon, and it says, we behave a certain way when we don't realize what we have been given. And that, I think, is so true. If we don't understand Christ as a great communicator, or that we are placed in him, or so many things, then how we live out our Christian life looks very different based off what we actually believe about who God is.
Yeah, what's the opposite of the message? The greatness of God. Well, the opposite of it is a watered down Jesus. It's a God we can put on the shelf. It's a God maybe we were born into a Christian home that we forget about or we're cool with and we move on from. But that's just not what we're called to do at all. And Hebrews is such an excellent resource and a really fun book to teach through because the application kind of hits you in the face a little bit. Hebrews 2:1. Pay much closer attention. Very specific Greek wording there. Pay much closer attention. Don't just listen up. Orient your life around this. Hebrews 3:1. Partakers of the heavenly calling, like understand what he's calling you to do. And then in Hebrews 4 and 5, it just continues in a way that's very practical, but in the same time always pointing people back to Christ. And that's why I also wanted to take the time to go to John chapter 1 to remind us, yes, the Word became flesh, but God is the great communicator that even through John the Baptist, through the author of Hebrews, he's doing the same thing. And I mean God, the great communicator, is doing the same thing. It comes down to Jesus.
And there are some parallel passages to this Hebrews text that are saying similar things and looking at it from just a slightly different perspective. I was alluding to Colossians. I mean, you're talking about John and looked at John 1. So were there challenges and struggles of where you were going to potentially go to bring out some of these truths? And then especially when it comes to application, you know, like,
oh yeah,
you do bring out. Okay, here's a few things for us to take away.
Yeah. That's the tension. I think in a sound biblical teaching environment, the hardest part is not teaching the passage you're supposed to teach. It's what are you going to use to support it? The Bible does an excellent job supporting itself. So where do you go and when? And so bringing in some of those New Testament passages that even support the phrase "these last days" was helpful, but you're in that tension of we're not going to interpret those books right now and dive into the weeds per se, but that it's enough to support, and then you keep the main thing. And that's why I love that, at least when it came to the application, it was just, by the way, this is all from Hebrews. This is the application the author had in mind when he wrote what we just read. So it's not us flipping all through. It is totally fine and good to flip to Jeremiah 28 to get a taste of God, great communicator, to read from 1st and 2nd Peter to get God's view of apostleship and what they're pointing towards. Go to 1 John and Jude to hear about these last days. But if you want the application of Hebrews 1, it's going to be Hebrews 2 through 5, probably, right? And so you look at it, it's right there, and then that's where you end. You give that to people. There's a call to worship, and then you just pray the Lord moves.
Yeah.
So,
can I ask just a preparatory question?
Sure.
So, as you're talking about that, again, we always talk about cutting room floor things in this podcast a lot. we don't always hear from Mark Carey of what he does to prep. But from your perspective, again, you're not necessarily preaching every week, but you're giving a lot of thought and research into it. It's almost like you're writing a research paper. I mean, every time you're preparing for a sermon like that, and then you're whittling it down to communicate. So what does that truly look like behind the scenes of that research and looking into these texts and passages? And then are you really writing out, like, word for word what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Some of it will vary per person and personality and giftedness and their own preparation. Don Den Hartog discipled me, and I think he did this well in the sense of some of Haddon Robinson stuff and Tony Evans and the big idea. You ought to be able to summarize the point of what you're doing in one sentence or two, or else you're all over the place. What are you pointing people towards? The greatness of God, and greatness leads to passion. So let's rally behind the greatness of God. So you can think of, at least in my case, sermon prep is an hourglass where you are writing and researching all these things, all these things. Right now I'm at least blessed with a ton of time ahead, weeks and weeks.
Right.
Which, maybe one day in the future that'll change. And I have done the weekly before where I'm preaching multiple weeks in a row. But you're praying, you're researching, you're reading, and you have all these thoughts, and then you need to organize them. So you get down to your main point, and then it's very slim. And then you grow it out from there, if that kind of makes sense. So
it's fascinating because you look at what you do, and it's very similar to Mark, and you're saying Don Den Hartog kind of gave you kind of some of that mold. And then you look at Tim, and he's walking around pacing with no notes in front of him, but he is just rattling things off. So it seems like it's off the cuff, but man, I've mocked him before. I'm like, Tim, looks like you don't prep at all. You just get up there and talk. But no, that is like, I don't want to insult him by saying that.
And it's a beautiful picture of the way God has gifted people and prepared them, right? So Tim's teaching style, he's coming from college students. He has this vivid history and experience teaching in that way. I'm a manuscript guy. I'm a writer at heart. I always have been. And so it helps me get to a point where I can communicate if I write and meditate and pray on it and measure it with scripture and all that good stuff. But you really need to focus on your exegetical outline, and then your homiletical outline, your homily, the actual speaking of it. So those illustrations and those decisions and those stories you come up with last, so that you're relying on scripture, but then you do want to try to paint that picture. And so that's where, I think from a preaching standpoint, and our teachers as well in BTC and even youth and children's, like, you do want to give a human story, and you do want to, if you're going to depart from the scripture, and I mean that in a good way, get to a point where there's some meat to it now, and you go, okay, that's what that means. That's what that actually looks like. And so I just chose to share that example of the vivid memory I have as a kid.
So you mean you didn't start with that? I thought you would start with a Michael Jordan jersey as the purpose and part of the sermon, right?
Right. Yeah.
You mean that's last?
Yeah, exactly.
Now I get it.
Exactly.
Good.
And then once it's last, you still pray over it. You're like, okay, Lord, is this going to detract from what you're trying to communicate, or is it going to add to it? And so you pray over that, and you make sure it doesn't, and so then you trust the Lord in that.
I had sorry, Emma Kate, I'm just going to say one more thing about here to Caleb, but I had the privilege of sitting behind your parents.
Wait, when?
Fellowship Saturday.
Saturday.
During the time, and watching them looking at each other and kind of whispering amongst themselves as you're telling stories of your childhood and potentially, like,
incriminating them,
or how their parental style was not what you were wanting and expecting, and then you bust out the jersey and they're laughing, and it brought back just the idea of the passing the torch, and here your parents were and raising you and discipling you, and here they are now in the pews as you're in the pulpit. I just appreciate it. I found it to be amusing, but also encouraging all at the same time.
Yeah.
And even more so, your mom's got her notepad out and she's taking notes, and that's just cool to say. The mom is like looking at the son and being like, okay, what am I going to learn today? What is God going to use through him to share, to impact me? I just found that to be exciting and encouraging.
I mean, they killed it as parents. I'm far from perfect, but I went up to my dad afterwards, like, I hope I didn't paint you and mom in this terrible light of, like, you're this horrific gift giver, and my dad's just goofing. And a lot of people did come up to me actually and share their own stories of the way their own parents have done that. You mislead with a gift, or it's a scavenger hunt, or you didn't realize what you were given. So it seemed to land, but again, it's just you study this stuff, and then you're at a personal point where you're, and I've told Emma and Micah this, it'll be a week or two out, and I'm like, I'm so ready to preach. Like, I'm so excited. I have it all there, and I see it. I've just recently learned it. I've meditated on it. So then it's get out of the Lord's way and pass that on so that we can all do that, which is another reason this podcast is here as well. But
Yeah. Love it. Final thoughts?
I think it was great. We even had some students who skipped their Sunday school classes because they wanted to hear Caleb
they did.
teach. So yeah, it was just exciting.
Did you give them any teasers to say, hey, you have to come because you're going to get a taste of, who the
Oh,
true
no
goat
way.
is?
Yeah.
Or-
I never really tell them I'm preaching. They just find out, and then but it's cool that they like to come up and do that. And even from a youth standpoint, we encourage them. Go to class 1 hour and then attend the worship service. They're a part of the church,
Yeah.
right?
Well, thanks for
So,
doing it.
Yeah.
And looking ahead,
Yeah.
even next week, we're looking at, again, that parallel passage is still going to be on the greatness of God. It is going to be that Colossians 1 passage.
Yep.
And that's Mark, I believe.
I think it
It's
is,
coming back.
yes. So I'll be in the pulpit in a couple weeks, Follow the Star weekend. I'll be doing Philippians 2, tying what we've been doing these couple weeks into the Christmas season specifically. So
Yep.
yeah, should
Yep.
come
So-
together well.
Well, I mean, it's a special season coming up. I'm excited, and what our church is going through leading into this Christmas season of a better perspective of Christ, I believe is fueling our worship, as we shared even last podcast, and it's fueling, I hope, at least it's fueling for me, I can speak for myself, just my personal journey and what I do on a regular daily basis. And getting us through election season and getting us, into whatever family conflicts that might be coming up. How can we use these things to apply to our lives and put our focus on Christ instead of ourselves?
Well, and I just want to do a quick plug. Thank you to the elders who do communion every week. Thank you to the worship team. The choir this weekend was awesome. I'm getting lunch with Borstad tomorrow, and I'm just excited to talk with him and encourage him a little bit because it's so cool to be a part of and see every week. So
Yeah.
it's been very exciting.
So speaking of holidays, so Hanging of the Greens is this coming Monday. So come on out to the church that evening. We've got Follow the Star, obviously, the following weekend after that, where there's still plenty of opportunities to serve. But start thinking about who you might invite. So that's that Saturday and Sunday night. That second, I guess you can kind of consider it second weekend of December. And then the Christmas Eve services. So put that on your calendar. Which one are you going to come to? 11 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock, or 7. There will be childcare provided for the 11 o'clock service. And then, I mean, there's actually a Christmas Day potluck that if you want to be a part of and just show up to the church and have just a good potluck dinner with your church family, go for it. So there's plenty of fun opportunities. Oh, by the way, there's also a December Biblical Training Center 2-week class that really, if you feel like that, whenever your kids have downtime, what are they gravitating to? Are they
technology.
Are they going to technology, especially in the holiday season coming up, where they're coming off of
School's off.
School's off.
Yeah.
And if you struggle with that as a parent, or like how to encourage them in that way, there's a 2-week course on just parenting when it comes to technology. They're in 2 weeks in December, and that's either 9 o'clock or the 10:45 slot. So go to the website for all those details, fbcva.org, and you can also hit /podcast to check out all the other podcasts and episodes here coming up here at FBC. So, Emma Kate, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Caleb,
You're the man. Appreciate it, buddy.
too. Yeah, man. So the fact of the matter, guys, is that sermons are not meant just to take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love. God bless.